All right, we're going to talk today about the main components or pieces of culture, elements if you will. And there are 4 or 5 main concepts that I want to cover today. And then we'll end with a discussion of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is one of the most frequently cited and used hypotheses in the discussion of culture from a sociological point of view. All right, so let's get started. The first element that we're going to talk about is language, and this would be the most important aspect of culture. And it's an abstract system of meanings and symbols that every culture has, which are specific to it. This includes nonverbal language, that's a type of communication such as gestures or facial expressions or other visual images. And anybody who's traveled outside of their homeland to another country knows well that you have to understand the gestures and facial expressions of that particular culture. And if you don't, sometimes it can get you into trouble. So in the world today, there are more than 6,000 different languages, and you have to consider what all of the different constructions of those languages have been, and about half of those are in danger of extinction according to the United Nations, and that's due to some cultures not having a written element to their language. And so when those countries have been overtaken by hostile elements from the outside, a lot of their linguistic elements have been lost. So we use language to convey meaning, to communicate with other people, and it is probably the most basic and complex element of culture at the same time. The second element we're going to talk about is norms. Norms are standards of behavior. Every society has norms, and they come in 2 different kinds of ways, either formally or informally. Now, formal norms are written and severe. This could be a law. For example, we have laws in our society against murder. Informal norms are not written down, and they're generally not severe. They're understood but not really recorded anywhere. These are the types of things, for example, where when you're out in public, you should behave a certain way. We can also break norms down further into what we call mores and folkways. Mores are necessary norms or standards of behavior for the welfare of society, and folkways are norms which govern our everyday behavior. So mores are more serious than folkways are. So going back to our example of murder, murder would be a more. We have a rule against murder in our society. It's a formal norm or a more. So an example of a folkway might be opening the door for a person. You may see a person coming to the door when you're shopping and they've got their hands full, and you hold the door open for them. Now, likewise, if you don't hold the door open for them, there's not really going to be any kind of serious penalty. That person might be muttering under their breath or thinking to themselves, how rude you are, but there's really no penalty against your behavior. All right, the next element of culture we're going to talk about is sanctions. Now, sanctions are penalties and rewards for conduct concerning social norms. So going back to the idea of folkways and mores, we have sanctions that either help us to encourage those behaviors or help us to inhibit those behaviors. So sanctions can be positive or negative. Some examples of positive sanctions: pay raises, words of gratitude, you could give out a trophy. And some examples of negative sanctions would be fines, threats, or imprisonment. If you do this, something bad will happen to you. So sanctions are, in effect, the actions that accompany the concepts of mores and folkways. The fourth element that we're going to talk about is values. Values are collective concepts of what is good, what is bad, what's desirable or undesirable, proper, improper, etc. And values influence our behavior. We internalize social values, and in turn, once we've internalized those values, we then behave accordingly. And we also evaluate other people by those internalized values. And so many of us maybe have been out to restaurants and it's been maybe late in the evening and we're having a nice dinner with our partner, and someone has brought their very young children to the restaurant at a late hour, and those children are maybe not being very well attended to, and we look at the parents with that look on our face like, what the heck are you doing? Well, this is a collective concept of desirable behavior in our society, that there's a certain place and time for children to be in a restaurant, and that it's a parent's job to try and maintain some sort of order at that table. And so if you don't, you get sanctioned by the rest of us in that restaurant, and that's because in our society we have certain values about those behaviors which are proper. Now, values do change over time, and I can give you another example here using restaurants. There is a recent movement in American society to establish child-free restaurants or child-free zones in restaurants or child-free times in restaurants. Say after 8 p.m., no children under the age of 9 are allowed. And that is a result of our values changing over time. And those values don't change in a vacuum. Let me explain to you this. We are having less and less and less children in our society. And so as our society grows older, our values change in response to our aging. And so lots of people in American society today have decided that they would prefer to dine in an atmosphere where there aren't young children. And the restaurant industry is changing in response to that value which is changing in our society. Okay, now the last concept that I want to talk about today, this is not necessarily an element of culture, but this is about language, and it's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis has been around for several decades, and it's the work of Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf, and they were anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, not sociologists necessarily, but this is an often quoted hypothesis when we're talking about language as an element of culture, and it has several premises, and here they are. Language precedes thought. Language is not a given. Language is culturally determined, and language colors how we see the world. And I want us to zero in on one of those concepts. Language precedes thought. I want to let that settle with you for a minute. How can you have language before you have thought? Now, philosophically speaking, this is the kind of hypothesis that if you think about it for too long, it makes you go crazy. So I don't want you to think about it for too long, but I want you to think about this in terms of, can you have language before thought, or can you have thought before language? Do you have language before thought, or do you have thought before language? And this is, in the field of philosophy, what we call a tautology. It's a circular thought or a circular argument. It's the same type of concept as the chicken and the egg. And that's what makes this a hypothesis. We can test it, but we can only test it within the bounds of our technological advances. And so we can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt that one comes before the other. And so we continue in the field of linguistic anthropology to think about and to theorize whether language comes first or thought comes first. And I don't want you to get too terribly concerned with that in the scope of a sociology class, but to me, that is the most interesting part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The rest of the hypothesis makes a lot of sense to me, and it's kind of logical. Language is not a given. Every single culture has different elements of its language. Language is culturally determined. What I choose to say in my language may be very different in your language. And language does color how we see the world. The meanings that are implied by the words that we use not only the denotations of those actual words, but also the connotations are very important. All right, so those are our 4 main elements of culture. We talked about language, we talked about norms, we talked about sanctions, and we talked about values. And then we spent a few minutes examining the complex idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I hope this helps. Take care. Bye-bye.